So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. And if you're in the back and you want to push up, I think we've got a cozy atmosphere here today, which is good because it can be interactive. And if you have questions as we go along, we can take those questions. So my name is Tom Allen, and I'm a shareholder at Greenberg Traurig in our international arbitration and litigation practice. And we're here today to primarily talk about foreign direct investment in Brazil, as well as different dispute resolution mechanisms that are going to be available in Brazil. And we thought it would be good to start by defining what we talk about when we're saying foreign direct investment. And so foreign direct investment at sort of its most basic definition is where a resident in one economy establishes a long-term interest in an enterprise in another economy. And there's different ways of defining it, but generally foreign direct investment is going to be distinguished from just a portfolio investment. So it usually involves some sort of influence or control. Different organizations might draw that line in a different place, but generally it's accepted about 10% of an interest in a foreign enterprise would be considered foreign direct investment. Obviously, if you have more control, then that would also qualify. And in terms of the United States, I think we're all probably familiar with this in the room, but the U.S. has historically been the largest foreign investor. In 2017, the U.S. Foreign direct investments in other countries totaled $350 billion. And when we're discussing foreign investment, what's at the top of most decision makers' list to consider is if I'm investing money in a particular jurisdiction, a particular locale, what type of protections are there for my investment? And we're speaking here about something aside from business risk. And I'll generically term it as legal risk. And when we're talking about legal risk, what we're going to do is we're going to be placing this into a number of different buckets during our conversation here today. We're going to be talking about investment treaties and treaty arbitration and how those can protect an investor's rights. We're going to delve into commercial arbitration. Those would be business-to-business disputes. We're going to be talking about the structure and the stability of the local judicial system, which is always one of those legal risk factors that you need to inquire about. And we're also going to be talking about obstacles to free trade. And that's something that's very topical with the current U.S. trade policy and U.S. tariff issues. And so we want to relate all of those topics to Brazil and what the landscape looks like in Brazil for those issues. Now, I mentioned that this is not a discussion of business risk, this is legal risk. So basically what you're saying is if I determine to put my capital at risk in a foreign enterprise, how well will my rights be protected in that foreign jurisdiction? And for business-to-business disputes, what does the arbitration or what does the court, the judicial system landscape look like? How are my rights going to be protected in those forums? Now, the gold standard, I would say, for how you're going to mitigate your risk, like if you were saying what would I look for in terms of established legal systems, I mean, if you're an investor, the first thing that you would probably look for is does my home country have an investment treaty with the country that's going to receive the investment? And does that treaty provide me with the types of protections that I would get as if I were a domestic business? And many of the treaties that you're probably familiar with have those types of rights. They're often called most favored nation rights or anti-discrimination provisions. They are designed to induce the foreign company to come in and invest with the idea that they will have the same rights, and in some cases maybe even better rights than domestic corporations in that jurisdiction. So if you have one of those treaties, and you have one of those treaties that provides for investor arbitration on top of it, That is probably, I would say, your first preference if you're making that foreign direct investment. Following up on that, if that country also has a good reputation for honoring investment arbitration decisions, then that is another factor that would be at that sort of gold standard of things that you're going to look for. Other factors that you would want to look for as well in evaluating the legal system where your investment might go are, not only is it a record of honoring decision in an investor state case, but what is the legal landscape looking like in terms of enforcing commercial arbitration agreements? Is there a good record for enforcing international arbitration agreements? Or are there interventionist courts that tend to try to take those decisions out of the parties' hands and thereby put you in a situation where you're really losing a lot of what you bargained for with respect to arbitration? And what you're looking for mostly is neutrality in the first instance. You're looking for neutrality. You're also looking for a system that where you have control over who hears your case. You can select your arbitrators in most instances. And you're also looking for enforceability. And so we'll talk about some of the treaties that are available for enforcement mechanism, most principally the New York Convention, which has about 157 countries, I think, at last look, who are members of these treaties. And then the final thing that I think we would want to consider in this discussion is, what sorts of free trade obstacles are there out there that are going to be a disincentive to you making those foreign investments. We have a lot of activity nowadays at our firm with clients wanting us to sort of predict the future, and particularly with respect to Trump foreign policy and Trump trade policy. They want to know, are tariffs here to stay? Are they going to expand? Lots of questions come out. People want to know, what does a second term of President Trump look like? Is he on his good behavior now? And then if we're in a second term, is he going to try to expand his powers to police trade in the United States? And so we want to know how Brazil fits into that rubric as well, because we're here principally to talk about Brazil. But keeping with the trade idea, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Parga. And Daniel is an associate at Greenberg Traurig, and he's resident in our international trade and international arbitration and litigation groups. He focuses his practice on many aspects of international trade and investment, including representing companies and foreign governments in trade remedy proceedings before the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. International Trade Commission, and the U.S. Court of International Trade. Daniel's experience also includes advising governments in the negotiation of free trade agreements, as well as acting on behalf of arbitration, as well as acting on behalf of companies, investors, and national governments in international arbitration proceedings conducted under the rules of the International Center for Settlement of Investor Disputes and the International Chamber of Commerce. Daniel also embarrasses me quite a bit because he conducts business in 3 different languages, including English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so with that, I'd invite Daniel to give us a little bit of an update on U.S. trade policy and how that fits into our discussion.
Well, echoing on Tom's comments, the case study of Brazil is very interesting from an international trade perspective. In recent years, of course, we've been seeing how it's been rising in international prominence, particularly in Latin America. It's reached the first spot in terms of market size. But perhaps if I say so myself, 2 of the most significant events in recent years for the Brazilian economy or for international trade policy have been the 2014 economic recession that Brazil faced for about 3 years, and it's still recovering from that, and also the election of current President Jair Bolsonaro and the policies that he's been pushing, along with the ministers, including the Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes. One significant way in which these two events have impacted Brazil's trade policies have been that, from the first perspective, from the economic recession, Brazil has been pushed closer to its largest economic and trade partner, which is China. Brazil has been cultivating a relationship with China for almost 2 decades in a very strong, in a very smooth way, and in a consistent way. And when the economic recession hit Brazil, of course, the market for natural resources and for commodities was a very reliable way for Brazil to get out of the crisis. And of course, China, being the first purchaser of these products, only became even more important in Brazil's economic well-being. This, as I will mention later, and we'll be, I'm sure, talking about it during the talk, during the conference, presents also a challenge to plans for U.S.-Brazil trade relations. But I'll get to that in a second. Also, in terms of the policies that President Bolsonaro has been imposing and has been promoting, is opening Brazil more to international trade. As you know, and as I'm sure you've seen and experienced probably in your work as well, Brazil is one of the most closed-off economies in the Western Hemisphere still, which is a legacy of many, many decades and many different governments. Now, with the new administration, Brazil is trying to open that and to liberalize. And under Minister Guedes, who is a very interesting person, he follows the Chicago School of Economics principles, which is a contrast to what President Bolsonaro was discussing when he was in Congress, right? And that's injecting a very different type of fuel than what we're used to seeing in Brazil. And just to put things in perspective, I'd like to go back to the Brazil-China trade relation, which is very important. Brazil exports roughly 1/4 of its products to China, which if you compare it to the next block, which is the European Union, it only exports 18% to them. But that's a variety of countries, right? And to the United States, it exports approximately 11%. And this is increasingly important, in particular in the context of the plans that the new administration has for Brazil. In terms of imports, China, as I mentioned before, is also the most important partner. Brazil gets 19% of its imports from China, followed by 15% from the United States and 24% from the various European Union countries. And if you do the math, this is important in terms of trading goods balances. If anyone in the audience or in the White House would like to pay attention to that for some reason, this is something to look at. Most of the products that come out of Brazil, as I mentioned, are commodities, soybeans being the most important. Moving to Paulo Guedes, the reason I emphasize his participation and his impact in Brazil is that he is imparting new ideas in terms of trade and investment policies in the country. And now I'm sure that Guilherme can probably talk more about this later, or maybe in the questions. Whether they happen or not is a different question. However, he's been discussing opening up state-owned entities to private investment and private ownership, such as the oil company Petrobras, Eletrobras, the electricity company Banco do Brasil. So this is a change in terms of how we perceive the nature of the typical foreign direct investment that comes into the country so far. In terms of Brazil's relations with other countries, Brazil has enjoyed steady and comfortable relations with many countries, especially in the region with Mercosur, which also presents its challenges in terms of international trade. And I'll get to that in a second when I discuss the possible or the rumored U.S.-Brazil free trade agreement. Brazil, as I mentioned, has very high tariffs for imports, and it also has one of the most infamously known amounts of red tape and paperwork that has to be completed and that is required in order to import goods into the country. But what does this mean for individuals and companies in the United States? Perhaps what brings most hope or what sets the horizon for U.S.-Brazil trade relations is, interestingly enough, the personal relationship between Presidents Bolsonaro and Trump. Many have said that they have similar personalities, similar ideologies in terms of politics, in terms of economic goals. And this perhaps is one of the most important motors that may, in the future, bring U.S. and Brazil together in the near future. There's currently no free trade agreement between the U.S. and Brazil, which is interesting, but there have been a number of commercial agreements recently between the two countries, including in the context of the Section 232 tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum, which Tom mentioned briefly. Brazil was one of the earliest countries to get an exemption from that, to get special treatment. Now, whether or not they got the best steel available, is a different question. However, it's interesting to see how quickly they were able to secure that. And it's only a handful of countries in the world, such as South Korea, now Mexico and Canada, and then, of course, Brazil since the outset, among other countries. This is very important because it sets the stage for potential future trade relations. We also have a new deal to export wheat from the United States, from the Midwestern countries to Brazil, under a duty-free agreement, which is very important for the Trump administration, and it has been one of the concessions that the Bolsonaro administration has given, considering that it's a country that is rich in natural resources. Another interesting agreement that there has been between the two countries is that the U.S. has preliminarily agreed to support Brazil's accession into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and also to reopen the U.S. market to beef exports, which is tremendously important for Brazil and the beef industry there, which is one of the largest. And this is, in a nutshell, the current state of Brazil's international trade policies. I'll be happy to answer any questions and participate in the future.
Introduce our next speaker now, Guilherme Amaral. And Guilherme is one of the founding partners of Suto Correia Advogados. He heads dispute resolution practice at the firm and has extensive experience in highly complex litigation, including class actions and arbitrations. He is a full member of the Commission of the ICC International Court of Arbitration on the Belt and Road Initiative. And we'll talk a little bit about that because that's obviously an exciting initiative involving China and massive infrastructure developments and investments to try to connect China essentially by land and sea through to the rest of the world. In broad terms, I mean, I think it's that ambitious. And Guilherme is very involved on behalf of Chinese clients and their business interests in Brazil. He was a visiting scholar at Queen Mary University of London that puts out our favorite international arbitration survey, so we're all probably very familiar with that. He has a master's degree and a PhD in civil procedural law and has authored books and various legal articles. He also has taught civil procedure at universities in postgraduate programs. He is a member of the committee that assisted the Brazilian House of Representatives in the drafting of the bill of the new Brazilian Code of Civil Procedure. He's got a lot of rankings that I'm envious of. My distinction is basically just being ranked as one of the tallest arbitration lawyers. But Guilherme has been recognized in Who's Who Legal, LACCA, Legal 500, Chambers and Partners, both globally and Latin America, and also Annalise Advocacia. So we're happy to have you here today, and I thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to you so we can learn much more about our friends to the south.
Well, thank you, Tom, for this opportunity. I'm very happy to be here to speak to all of you, and very happy to hear Daniel's words about Brazil. I think we are all very optimistic in Brazil about this turn of events. As we speak now, the Brazilian Congress is voting on the public pension reform, which is essential to lower our public deficit. So it's a very exciting moment in Brazil, and my idea here is to, first of all, try to give you some context on the recent history in Brazil. I think that foreign media in general does not have even enough time to explain to you what's going on in Brazil for the past 5 years. It's been so many events. Netflix series have been made about what we live in Brazil. They're very good, by the way. I suggest you, at least some of them. The most recent one is not that good, but I suggest you watch it. But I'm going to talk about the recent history of Brazil and how it relates to the topic of this panel, which is FDI in Brazil and its protection. So you see in this picture some scenes of Brazilian recent life. You see that our then candidate to the president, there was an attempt against his life. He was almost killed in this attempt. He was then elected president. You had Judge Moro putting the former president Lula, and very popular president, into jail. You have the people taking on the streets to impeach President Dilma. So that's a lot going on in Brazil. But I'll try to give you some chronological sense to that, and so for us to be more rational about how to look at this event. So this graphic you see is this Brazilian stock market in the past 5 years. So you can see that the one who invested back in 2014, 15, earned a lot of money if you had the cold blood to leave the money in the stock market in Brazil. But I start with the so-called Lava Jato or car wash operation. It's a sting operation that started basically in a car wash place. That's where the name comes from. But it started going up and reached the highest level of our political system with the investigation of the former president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And you see when the operation began in March 2004, we had the stock exchange on about 50,000 points. Then in November 2014, the market was shocked by the news that many Petrobras contractors, and I'm talking about the CEOs of those companies, were thrown into jail in one of the phases of this car wash investigation. And then you see that the market began reacting pretty badly, as we would expect, to this turn of events. On December 2015, the impeachment hearings began in Brazil, and you see that it's a lot going on, a lot of doubts whether we would be able, Brazil would be able to put Dilma out of power and to have Temer taking power. There were a lot of doubts about that, and so the market was very nervous. It almost collapsed by the beginning of 2016, but on May 2016, former President Dilma is ousted, and Michel Temer becomes acting president. So then you can see that the stock market began to react right on that point when we saw that Congress had enough votes to impeach Dilma. The market began to react very positively. And Michel Temer became the acting president. That did not mean that President Dilma would be definitively ousted. We still needed a confirmation by the Senate. And that came in August 2016. And you see that the stock market was really going very well back then. And then Temer is sworn in as the 37th president of Brazil for good. And what did we all expect from the business side? That Brazil would be ready to leave that corruption problems behind, even though the investigation was still ongoing, but we could finally be looking at a more stable period of time. In political terms, that did not happen. In May 2017, right after this turn of events regarding impeachment and President Temer, we had the so-called JBS scandal, some wiretapping involving the president and the former CEO of JBS Group. And basically this guy recorded the former then vice president basically kind of instructing him that the payment of bribes to politicians should go on. And we expected then that Brazil would collapse because we had just thrown out a president and we were about to throw out another one. Interestingly enough, what happened after that is that we didn't see enough political willfulness from the left party or from any other party to throw out Michel Temer from power. And the market kept growing. And then we had the election year in 2018. That was a very difficult year because what we all saw that there was a very high risk of the Workers' Party winning the election even after Lula was put in jail by Judge Moro. That would be. I'm not here taking any political stance, but just to make sure. But the important thing to remember is that we all were very happy with the way corruption was being tackled by the car wash operation. So it would demoralize us if the same party, the main party that was coordinated all the corruption efforts, would be put into power again. There was a clear perception that if that happened, all the efforts again to tackling corruption would go down the drain and everything would come back to what it was before. So it was a very nervous year, and that we saw that in that election year we had some imbalance in the stock market. Then Bolsonaro is elected president, and there's some things that should be said about Bolsonaro. When you read the coverage that the media has given to Brazilian election, the easiest story to tell is to simply compare Bolsonaro to Trump and to say lots of bad things about Bolsonaro that I'm not going to say here because they're being recorded, right, Tom?
We can turn the camera off.
Yeah. Well, probably in the debates we can do that, yeah. But the truth of the matter is that, yes, Bolsonaro has some important issues regarding his background, his culture, has some generational problem in all developing countries, and his behavior can be explained a lot by that. But what I feel, and I'm not talking here as a lawyer, but what I feel as a Brazilian, is that this guy is actually trying to put the country back on track. He has all these defects, but his main purpose is to have a more austere government, less public spending, more privatization, free market, relationship with all countries without ideology, biased mentality, and the fact that he has Paulo Guedes as the Ministry of Economy is a telling example of how he wants to make things work. Paulo Guedes is called in Brazil an American boy or Chicago boy. And when he was here in Washington, I think it was the beginning of this year, and he told to American businessmen and to the American government that we Brazilians, we love the United States more than anything. We love McDonald's, we love Coca-Cola or Coke. We love that. But the United States has to learn how to dance with Brazil, and China already does. China is dancing with us for a long time now. Since 2009, China has been our main commercial partner. So yes, we want to do business with the United States, but we need to learn how to dance together. And I think this was a very important message from Paulo Guedes to show that this new government is open to everyone.
Is that, let me just ask, is that a double entendre there? Is the commentary also that people in the United States don't actually know how to dance?
I wouldn't say that. He lived here for a long time, and I'm not sure that Bolsonaro and him know how to dance either.
That's so a yes.
I think, yeah.
Do we need to turn the camera off again?
No. We can dance later on, and then we turn the camera off. So in 2018, October 2018, Bolsonaro finally wins the runoff against Haddad and becomes Brazil's 38th president. And from them, you've seen a clear and a steep rise of the Bovespa index. Recently, you've probably heard about the leaking of messages between Sergio Moro and the federal prosecutors regarding investigation against Lula. Even that didn't stick to the new government. The stock market keeps going up, and it seems like we're in a good mood now to pass this reform. Probably by the end of this, hopefully, by the end of this panel today, we have the news that the public pension reform has passed. So that's, I think this graphic shows why we all have reasons to be optimistic with Brazil, regardless of the fact that we had in the political arena, very troublesome incidents along the time. Also, very good news for Brazil and for Mercosur in general. The agreement was not signed only by Brazil, but also by other countries from the Mercosur. It's expected that if it passes Parliament, because it still needs to have a legal review of the documents, and the Parliament, European Parliament, and this Mercosur countries' Parliament has to vote. They have to vote, but there's probably not going to be any trouble to pass this treaty. And it's very important for us. It's going to generate, and we're going to talk more about this on the debate. I'm just going to add that it's supposed to generate about $90 billion increase in our GDP in 15 years. And it also is supposed to generate what we're calling there a domino effect, which means that Brazil is ready to do the same thing with the United States and its new region with Canada and Mexico, and with other countries and other regions as well. That's what the government is looking for, actually, to promote free trade around the world. And I think they're doing a great job doing that because they did it in such a small period of time. It's important to mention that this deal has been negotiated for the past 20 years. So it's not only the new administration merit, but it's like in soccer. We say that you can have a great team, everybody passes really well, but you have to have the center forward who makes the goal. So I think if this government has one merit to score the goal in the end, even though other players have played a very important role in these negotiations. So now directly into foreign direct investment in Brazil. It is interesting that from what Tom said before, Brazil is not a signatory to BITs. Brazil does not believe historically to bilateral investment treaties. They have a Brazilian political class. They actually believe that, and I think they have some empirical evidence of that. And in most cases, investment treaties, the cases are brought against developing countries, and the awards are issued against developing countries. And so that's why I think Brazil has never adopted a more positive stance towards that. The argument they make in Brazil is also that it has never hindered Brazil from receiving foreign investment. Quite the contrary, Brazil ranks fourth among the FDI host economies according to this latest report, and is the only Latin American country among the top 10 list. I think it's not quite precise or honest, intellectually honest argument, because we do not know how it would be if we were signatories to investment treaties. So we have no way to compare. So if Brazil already attracts that much investment, how about if we were to sign those treaties? How would that be? So I can anticipate that we do not have investment treaty arbitration in the deal with the European Union. We have state-to-state arbitration only in that. So, but it's important to know that Brazil is still one of the countries in the world that attracts most investments. And in 2017 and 2018, you have here a comparison of the investments in the first semester of each year, and you see that it's from the foreign investment side, Spain and China have been the largest investors in Brazil in this period. A long time we've seen more and more Chinese investment, and I would say that about 95% of all Chinese investment in Brazil is in the energy sector. So this is also a very important characteristic of this foreign investments in Brazil. And finally, how about new opportunities? So what is the new government, and not only in the federal level, but also in the state level, preparing to offer our foreign investors? I was telling Tom before, I'm going to leave this presentation to all of you that came here, because there's a lot of detail in it that I cannot go through in this small period of time. But you see from all the detail that that's actually lots of opportunities for foreign investors in Brazil. For instance, there is the Petrobras divestment plan. You will not be able to read those small letters. So suffice to say that it involves a divestment in 5 different areas: oil and gas platforms, fertilizer industry, gas distribution, power plants, and refineries. So in all these areas, Petrobras is planning to divest or to sell companies, and this is a great opportunity for foreign investment, especially if the oil prices go up. In the electricity sector, we have lots of auctions going on. Already in 2019, we have auctions planned, 2020 and 2021. So we have a triannual plan for investments in electricity. It involves transmission lines, it involves the net generation of energy, so energy supply. So there's also good opportunities in the electricity sector. Oil and gas. So we have some bidding rounds for many areas in which oil can be explored, such as Atapu, Búzios, Itapu, Sépia, and the Santos Basin, and many others. And that's the same for many other regions in Brazil, and also a triannual plan for that. So it's been a challenge in the oil sector in Brazil. The cost of drilling, especially in the pre-salt, has been very high in comparison to the price of the oil in the international market. As the price of the oil comes up, the pre-salt becomes more feasible for investors. So now it's getting better to invest in Brazil as well. In the transportation, the concession of roads and railways and ports in Brazil are also expected to soar in the next 3 years. We've seen a lot of Chinese interest in ports because they need to make the agricultural products leave Brazil in a cheaper way, so it gets easier for them. So it compensates for Chinese to invest in ports in Brazil because they have the port to explore, and they also will buy agricultural products in a lower price. So it's doubles the interest for the Chinese to invest in those areas. Our firm has been sought for many Chinese clients to analyze plans to acquire these ports in Brazil, from north to south of Brazil. So that's on the transportation side. And with that small introduction, I think we can then move to how these foreign direct investments are actually protected in Brazil if we do not have those treaties.
You mentioned the European Union Mercosur country agreements. Now, am I correct that agreement does not include investor protections?
Yes, that agreement, we do not have the full text because it's been reviewed, but we have the outline that was provided by the European Union. And what we see is that we have provision for state-to-state arbitration, but you can also have commercial arbitration. So, because you can have commercial arbitration with public entities for example, in Brazil, but you do not have the investment arbitration as we were used to. Yeah.
Okay, so that was one of my questions. So are there special rules for commercial arbitration with respect to state-owned entities?
Yes, there are some rules that apply in Brazil. Most states are issuing decrees, and these decrees provide that you have to have an arbitration seated in that specific state instead of seated elsewhere. But in general, if it's not in the state level, you can have arbitration against public entities outside of the place where the entity is. You cannot have ex equit bono arbitration with public entities in Brazil. It has to be arbitration in law, which is, the standard in all arbitration in Brazil in general. So there are not many restrictions in commercial arbitration, and what I've seen so far is of course it's still in the beginning of this experience, but what I've seen is an equal treatment of public and private entities, be it in international arbitration, be it in the judiciary system in Brazil.
And as I understand it, the Mercosur agreement with the EU has been something that's been negotiated for many years.
Yeah, 20 years.
So this is not a response to what's going on with U.S. trade policy in any way, is it? Or
it's a very interesting question. It's difficult to say because this negotiation has been going around a long time. And why has it been successful now? So that could be one of the reasons. But my guess would be that South America needs that. South America needs to be more efficient in the way it does trade, cannot be isolated as it was. We're seeing a lot of trouble in Argentina, a lot of trouble in Brazil, not to mention other countries. So we clearly understand that we have to accept that other countries have developed technology better than us. We have to accept that. We have to lay down the taxes against let those products come in our territory without taxes, and then also allow for our agricultural products and commodities to get in there. And that's how we're going to develop our economy and later on our own technology.
Okay. And the reason why I ask the question that way is because I feel like there's opportunity here for sort of blocks of trading groups that don't involve the U.S. And I'll give the example, and I'll turn it to Daniel for a minute here, of Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Mm-hmm. Now, the U.S. withdrew from that agreement, but it didn't die. It became CPTPP, and it still involves 11 different nations. And so my question, and it can be to both of you, because what I was reading about this new agreement between Brazil and the EU, I'm wondering if other countries are going to start to say, well, we can't wait around for the U.S. We're going to look at this, and see where our global interests lie. And if the U.S. is a part of those agreements, great. If they're not, that's okay too. And the question, I guess, start with Daniel, is: Are you seeing other potential regional trade blocs or agreements on the horizon that would not involve the U.S., since the U.S. appears to be taking a bilateral approach to trade agreements right now?
Well, I think that's actually a very important question, especially considering that NAFTA was just renegotiated, right? And for months, the Trump administration was saying that they could do away without NAFTA and just sign bilateral free trade agreements. That seems to be the current approach that the United States wants to take. Instead of engaging in blocs and multilateral trade agreements, it seems to be preferred, at least in speech, that the country reach agreements bilaterally with other countries. Now, the problem with this is, in practice, sure, perhaps there could be a way to make it work, but legally speaking, and in terms of international law and international agreements, the problem is that many agreements, such as Mercosur, prohibit their individual members from engaging, or even the European Union from engaging in bilateral trade agreements with other countries. So, for example, if the United States wants to sign a free trade agreement with Brazil, it would have to negotiate also with Argentina, with Paraguay, and with Uruguay, right? Because it's the Mercosur agreement. That's one of the clauses. And unless Brazil is willing to make sure that these other three countries come to the table, which would have its intricacies politically and economically speaking, or unless Brazil is willing to leave Mercosur, which is a different question, I definitely see very difficult for the United States to join at least the Brazil in terms of focusing in this trade relationship. We also saw it recently with the European Union, even though the United States was negotiating with the European Union as a whole a trade agreement. When the new administration came in, everything fell through the cracks, as well as it did with the TPP, and like you mentioned, the comprehensive and progressive TPP came out. This is certainly a loss in leadership for the United States, and it seems counterproductive from what is being discussed in terms of international presence and international relevance. It leaves the door open for many other countries to engage in trade that is not necessarily perhaps the most convenient or the most preferential to the United States. We see this when the TPP was being negotiated. One of the purposes was to secure markets and to protect markets from China. And the countries that were engaged to say, hey, let's work together, let's trade goods, and let's try to stay away from arguably perhaps certain predatory practices or certain products that are coming into our country at lower prices and that are damaging our economies. So In summary, yes, I do see how the United States will be losing out on many um, perhaps multilateral trade agreements because it seems to be the policy and the direction that the Trump administration is taking. However, when it comes to actually engaging in bilateral trade agreements, it's much more complicated than that.
I know also that one of the big things that the Trump administration needs is a win on agriculture. We need better access for our farmers and their products right now. And I thought I heard you saying that U.S. agriculture was a part of that in terms of access to U.S. beef markets. And did I hear you say that right?
Right.
Okay.
Right, that's great. So the United States and Brazil have signed we can call it a commercial agreement or an understanding, binding understanding apparently, that Brazil has is willing to open up the market to imports of wheat from the United States. And in exchange, the United States is sending technical reviewers from the Department of Agriculture to perhaps bring more expediency to opening the market for beef again. Beef from Brazil. Of course, it's many steps away, but this is certainly something that the Trump administration is looking for, and also this is also relevant because of the trade confrontation, or some people call it the trade war with China. Right, the United States lost a big market there for agricultural products, so the U.S. is looking for other sources of other markets and other people.
And then TPP also, or CPTPP. A lot of the preferences that the U.S. was going to get on agriculture there ended up going to the countries that stuck with CPTPP. And so I think when you're talking about multilateral deals, isn't there a risk that rights are being given and preferential rights are being given away in these bigger, larger multilateral contexts? And it'll be harder for the U.S. to come on later and say, no, we want those same things too. I think that's something that we're going to be asking for in Japan down the horizon. So last question for you right now, Daniel, is the Trump administration seems to be sequencing these things, right? So we had USMCA, which is not yet passed in the U.S., and we have trade talks with China that are off and again and on again, and there's discussions about entering trade talks with Japan. So do you think that the progression will still be sequential? And then if so, where do you see Brazil fitting in? When will we get around to negotiating with Brazil if in fact that's going to happen? This is why we pay you a handsome salary, Daniel, so that you can give these prognostications here.
Well, those are very controversial questions. In fact, what Bolsonaro is doing, I believe I mentioned it, is he's establishing rapport and a personal relationship with Trump, right? Which seems to be the way to get into being in a good side with the United States. And Prime Minister Abe from Japan is also doing a similar thing, right? You see them playing baseball and going golfing together, and they definitely seem to be something different that many other countries are not doing. And this seems to be helping them reap many benefits in terms of trade and investment relations with the United States. Now, whether other countries are doing the same thing or are willing to do the same thing, we need to get to see that. But one of the unexpected things and one of the unpredictable qualities of the current administration in the United States is that it's very difficult to approach. It's very difficult to know how to reach them, whether it's through the Department of State, which former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson complained that everyone was always going around him, or going directly to the White House. It's very difficult to do that. I would not venture into saying whether this will continue happening in terms of the United States going on a sequential basis with other countries. I definitely see it happening. I think it would be natural to see attempts for it to happen. Whether it's going to be successful, I think that's a different story. And in terms of reaching a deal with Brazil and the United States, I think all the cards are on the table. There are rumors that maybe the two administrations, Bolsonaro and Trump, will try to find a way to make it happen. However, it's very, again, we go to China, it's very complicated. Brazil has already established a very sturdy and very strong trade relation with China. If Brazil is willing to give more access to U.S. goods, that will necessarily mean giving less access to China. And it's interesting because the United States currently in its policies with China is trying to isolate it and trying to keep it away from fully engaging in the global economy. And we see it in the form of Section 301 tariffs on imports of goods from China. It's very difficult to say that there is another country in the world that has benefited more from this trade war between the United States and China than Brazil. Because China has been buying less agricultural products from the United States, and it has been buying more from Brazil. So is Brazil willing to give up this relation and this strong tie to China to see what happens with the United States?
Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a couple. Yeah, well, the problem is that for Brazil, and one of the things that scared me the most when the new administration took office is that the foreign minister said that he specifically said that he did not want to, he preferred to do business with the United States rather than with China. And I heard that and I thought to myself, this is, there are two black belts having a fight, and this white belt wants to pitch in and to cheer for one of the fighters. But what if those two black belts decide to make peace with each other? One of them is going to look at the white belt and say, what did you say about me back then? So I think that Brazil is not in a position to be taking sides here. Brazil has to observe, watch, and take the best of it in the best way it can. Yes, it may seem like a very good opportunity to sell more soybeans to China, but at the same time, if United States and China strike a deal, certainly part of this deal will involve China buying more and more soybeans from the United States. And that how would that leave Brazil? Also, last year, I saw an interview of President Trump. Everybody was asking him about China. And in what is a very typical move of him, he diverted the discussion and said, you're talking about China, but nobody here is talking about Brazil. Brazil is also treating us very badly. And he said that out of the blue. I mean, nobody was talking about Brazil. And that scared me a lot as well, because it's very difficult to negotiate with someone that out of the blue, they come up with a strange idea that you're his enemy. So I think that the best thing for Brazil to do right now is, yes, try to strike as many deals as he can with the United States, keep doing business with China, but not taking any stance. Trying to just observe and use the help of its countries, brother countries from Latin America. I think it's very important for Brazil to negotiate together with Argentina, for example, which attracts a lot of investment. If you compare in terms of the population of both countries proportionally, Argentina attracts more Chinese investment than Brazil in terms of proportion to the population. Of course, not in total numbers. But so I think that it's a very sensitive moment for Brazil. We have lots to deal with internally. It's not time to pick up fights and pick up sides in this huge war with between the United States and China. And also, we do not have the problem with we're not in a technology race with China. We do not have intellectual property problems with China. We do not have military issues with China. So we do not have any reason to be having this type of discussion with them. So,
sticking with China, you're a member of the ICC Belt and Road Commission, and I'm wondering what role you see Brazilian businesses playing in the billions of dollars of infrastructure projects that are, some of which have begun and will continue to evolve over the next decade or more. Where do you see Brazil's role in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, the Belt and Road, the conventional Belt and Road, I would say, was this idea of resuscitating the old Silk Road. So there's the Maritime Road, and there's this terrestrial belt. So that's Belt and Road. It's a little bit confusing because when you think about road, you're not thinking of maritime, but it's the maritime road and the territorial belt connecting China and Europe and China and Africa. But what it turns out that the Belt and Road has become much greater than that. The Belt and Road is actually, and what we call now the non-conventional Belt and Road, is actually a mindset. It's a Chinese mindset of how to invest in other countries. So it involves, yes, it involves leveraging these investments, involves lending money to some poor countries. And I think that Brazil has been receiving lots of investments from China before this idea was crafted by Xi Jinping. And so I think it's only natural that Brazil keeps receiving these investments regarding of signing any MOUs with China, because I think that if I'm not mistaken, Panama has signed an MOU with China recently. I think Chile has also done that. But I don't think that Brazil even needs to do that. It's just an MOU. That's how Chinese do business. They just like to set some principles, but no hard rules on how to invest. So I think that Brazil is going to still be playing a major role as a recipient of Chinese investments, especially in infrastructure, which we desperately need in Brazil.
Thank you. And I spoke a little bit about in my introductory remarks, and you touched upon it again about the lack of investor-state treaties that Brazil is involved in. And so I want to shift it to the actual a little bit more nuts and bolts on the ground. If a company is making a foreign direct investment in Brazil, and Brazil is not a party to any of these treaties that have direct investor recourse through ISDS, what does the legal landscape look like for investors in Brazil to obtain recourse if they feel like their rights are not being respected?
Yeah. Well, the most extreme act that a government can take against an investor is expropriation. We do not have a history of expropriation, recent history of expropriation in Brazil. It's quite the contrary. Brazil is selling all these public companies and doing more and more concessions and privatization programs. So it's not going to happen in Brazil in the near future.
And expropriation, just to make everybody aware, we're on the same, expropriation is, would you describe it essentially as almost a nationalization of the assets? Yes,
nationalization of the assets, yeah. So what happens is that foreign investors, of course, they can rely on commercial arbitration in Brazil. Brazil is the third country with most parties in ICC arbitrations. So arbitration is a big and important thing in Brazil for foreign investors. It has been there for a long time. We have a very good track record in our judiciary of protecting arbitration, even though there are some cases that are controversial. We may touch upon them later on. But we have very good track record. And also the judicial system in Brazil, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that we have any bias in favor of public Brazilian companies and against foreign companies. What I can say is sometimes taxpayers feel that there is a bias in favor of the tax authorities. I can say that. But I've never seen bias against foreigners in Brazil. I think the Brazilian judiciary is quite aware of our need to treat foreign investors the same way we treat national investors. It's good for the country, and we have a very strong and independent judicial system. There's lots of examples recently to show that. The fact that a first instance judge has thrown a former president to jail tells you a lot about that. So I think that foreign investors should not be worried about these legal risks in Brazil. There are, of course, other risks involved, taxation, the complexity of our tax system, labor regulations, which are very strict and very difficult to tackle in Brazil. So there are other concerns, but I wouldn't say that the legal protection of foreign investments would be one of them.
And do you represent foreign parties in Brazilian courts?
Yes, I do a lot. And when we're talking about the Chinese, I'm usually on the Chinese side of any dispute and not on the Brazilian side. So I get to see firsthand how Brazilian courts treat foreign investors. But I can also tell you that sometimes the case is very difficult for a foreign investor, and it is not it's not because the investor is facing a Brazilian company, but because the investor is facing a sensitive issue. So, for instance, if you are a creditor of a school or of a hospital, or some company that provides essential services, of course it's going to be more difficult to enforce a judgment against these companies. But that is difficult also for Brazilian companies to do that, because there is social concern or a public concern that you can bankrupt this public essential company. So that the difficulty is not related to the foreign aspect of the dispute.
Okay. How would you describe the attitudes within the business community in Brazil about agreeing to international arbitration in their cross-border transactions?
Every single international cross-border transaction I see in Brazil, they all have arbitration clauses. I have never seen
It means you're doing your job in
yeah.
promoting
Yeah,
arbitration.
you know what? I mean, business people, they always come with the arbitration in their minds. Of course, whenever a client loses an arbitration, not with us, but whenever a client
course,
loses.
But he told me earlier, no money back guarantees
Yeah.
if there is a loss. So.
Whenever a client has had a bad experience with arbitration, he associates the result with a bad experience in arbitration. It does not discern a bad result from a bad arbitration, and those things are pretty much different. So sometimes there is this type of confusion on the client's mind, but practically every single contract, every single agreement, the important agreement, has arbitration clauses.
And Brazil is a member of the New York Convention
Yes.
on the recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitral awards. Okay.
Yes,
But Brazil has not adopted the model UNCITRAL law.
Yeah, it has adopted most of it.
Okay.
There's some small and not relevant differences from the model. All the basic principles are there.
And so, under what circumstances, or do they essentially model the circumstances that you would find in the New York Convention? But under what circumstances in Brazil can a foreign arbitration award be invalidated, or may a Brazilian court refuse to enforce it?
It mostly are the same of the Article 5th of the New York Convention. I don't see Brazilian courts going far from Article 5th. So.
And there's one more question related to this. In the international arbitration community, there was a case that got some press internationally recently, and maybe you can help me with the names here.
Abengoa case.
Abengoa. Well, that's easy. That's pretty phonetic. Abengoa. And as I understand this case, the Brazilian court refused to enforce a roughly $100 million award. It was an ICC award, and they did so on public policy grounds. And the public policy that was implicated there was a conflict of interest of an arbitrator. And a lot of the commentators were looking at this as evidence that maybe Brazil wasn't as pro enforcement of arbitration awards as it was thought to be. And I don't know if that's the correct impression. I just know that that's how some people were reporting it. I wondered if you have some comments.
Yes, I wouldn't report it like that. We may criticize the decision from the Superior Court of Justice, but there's some logic to it. Basically, we're dealing here with a duty to disclose, and the U.S. court decided that the arbitrator did not know that his firm was working for one of the parties in the arbitration. It wasn't even working directly, it was working through the public administration, but the arbitrator did not know, and therefore, according to the FAA, that was not grounds for the challenge. But the problem is that Brazilian arbitration law does not require that the arbitrator knows about that. He has to do his or her due diligence. So, according to Brazilian law, an arbitrator would not be able to sit in this panel if his or her firm had business with the client, even if he or she did not participate on that, on those cases. So, and it's a matter of public policy. I mean, the impartiality of the arbitrator is a matter of public policy. There are some technicalities involved because when it comes to impartiality, this is the only part of our arbitration law that makes reference to the Civil Procedure Code. No other provision of the Civil Procedure Code is applicable to an arbitral proceeding except for the provisions regarding impartiality. And what the arbitration law says is that an arbitrator someone cannot sit as an arbitrator if he falls under one of the provisions of the Civil Procedure Code regarding impartiality. However, so if he cannot, it's a public policy thing. But in the Code of Civil Procedure, there are two different types of impartiality, which is impediment and suspicion. And suspicion is not considered a public policy issue. In this case, you could it could fall squarely into a suspicion provision, and therefore you could argue that even though the arbitration law says talks about that the arbitrator cannot sit as an arbitrator, you could still make the point that if it's a suspicion case, he or she could sit as an arbitrator because it's not a public policy issue. But there is also a provision regarding impediment that could be applied in this case, which is when someone close to the arbitrator works for one of the parties. And in case to the someone close to the judge, but it's applicable to the arbitrator as well. So you could use that ground to challenge the arbitrator. So overall, I think it was a natural decision. I don't see it as a bizarre decision. And I would add the following. I think that up until that decision, the Superior Court of Justice had been acting like a rubber stamping of foreign arbitral awards. They were not getting into Article 5th adequately. So I think now the court is saying that there is such a good thing as an annulment of an arbitral award when it has to be annulled. So they're not going to be just rubber stamping awards. That does not mean they're not friendly to arbitration. It's quite the contrary. They're being more aware of the importance and legitimacy of arbitration, and they want to protect it. So.
Yeah, and from my perspective, if a decision is being made based on a perceived lack of impartiality, that's not really an anti-arbitration decision. That's something that's looking to preserve the integrity of the proceeding. Yes. So you can take issue, I think, with how that case has been reported. And other jurisdictions are also tightening up their conflict of interest rules. There was a big case by the Supreme Court in Japan recently where they imposed an affirmative duty to inquire, to make a reasonable inquiry about conflicts, and that was a continuing duty. It's not just at the beginning of the case. They held that you had to continue throughout the case to make that reasonable inquiry. We have about 15 minutes on our time, so I wanted to, if we can, yeah, and your hand is raised at an appropriate time. Why don't we, and we had a microphone here, if you want to, or you may not. I mean, you could probably just hear. It's not. This isn't MetLife Stadium. It's the MetLife building.
So this question can be posed for an investor perspective as well as a legal perspective. But looking at a potential U.S.-Brazil trade agreement, let's just say hypothetically that happens with the same political makeup we have in the United States, before 2020 or after 2020, based on what we've seen with the last week of the Commerce Department saying that currency manipulation can be a countervailable subsidy and all that stuff, and then House Democrats talking about labor environment enforcement mechanism in USMCA, what could a potential deal look like, but between two conservative people relative to Mexico and Canada, which are progressive or liberal left-leaning candidates? Like, what could a potential deal look like based on what we've seen in the last 6 months to a year?
I think it's probably for either of you, but maybe we could just restate the question as you understand it, and one of you can take it.
Well, from what I understand is you're trying to see what a potential U.S.-Brazil deal could look like, right? Whether it would follow similar paths as the typical FTAs or
right,
or
based on the two parties that would be negotiating it with Bolsonaro and Trump,
right,
of a different makeup than Trudeau, AMLO, or even Peña Nieto and Trump?
Right. It's that's a very good question. Brazil just finished negotiating. Mercosur just finished negotiating, concluded talks with Chile. It's a pretty modern free trade agreement. I think that could give us certain clues of what the current administration in Brazil is looking for, and that was it was of course negotiated by the four Mercosur countries, but it was in a very good deal pushed by Brazil and the Bolsonaro administration. So that could perhaps give us some clues on the U.S. side and the U.S. perspective. And I already see Guilherme disagreeing.
No, I'm not.
No, I'm joking. But from the U.S. perspective, you're absolutely correct. We are seeing many different ideas that the Trump administration is floating as something that they would see as essential in agreements with other countries. Like you said, currency manipulation with many countries. And we also see once in a while many people talking about getting rid of investor state protection. We see it in USMCA that it's a hybrid between no protection for Canada and then certain protections with Mexican investors in terms of U.S.-Mexico flow investments. It's quite difficult to foresee what is going to happen and what would happen in such a context, especially because Brazil and the United States have very similar economic goals, at least in the current administrations. However, I think the renegotiations of the USMCA as well as the Mercosur negotiations with Chile could potentially be good signs of what the two countries will look for.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I only think that the trend in Brazil, I think, is for the government to be very pragmatic in these negotiations and not make a case against a different party, a different ideology. What Brazil does not want to do is invest money in other developing countries, as the former governments have done in the past, based on political alliances. This is something that we cannot do. First of all, because it's simply not right to do that based on ideology. The second thing is because we do not have the money to do that. And the third thing is that if we had the money to do that, we would invest in ourselves because we're in the need of investment in Brazil. So I think that you'll be looking at, and Daniel touched a very important point. We negotiated with left-wing presidents in Europe. So I don't think that that's going to be necessarily an issue. You won't be seeing Brazil negotiating with Venezuela anytime soon, though.
And what about part of the question, I think, was the enforceability of environmental standards and also labor standards, which has been a question, I think, with the USMCA. Specifically, do you see any potential landmines there?
There is, including for this Mercosur deal, this is one thing that could actually delay a little bit the actual ratification of the treaty, because France and Germany raised some concerns about the Amazon. There's also some misreports about the situation in the Amazon. The situation in the Amazon has been bad for a long time, and since 2012 has gotten much worse. This government is in place for 6 months. You cannot solve this problem so quickly. But it's not a creature of this administration. It's a creature of the previous administration. So that's a problem we have to tackle. I think countries in general are tackling these problems. Look what China is doing with pollution. They're lowering the indexes day by day. I think that's what Brazil is going to do. And Brazil has much more protection to the environment than Germany and France altogether. So more native land than they have altogether. And so, but I think you describe it well. It can be a landmine, especially for political reasons. I think that some presidents want to make a political stance by playing for the environment, even when they do not do their homework at home.